It's particularly refreshing in light of our current tribal and partisan environment to go back to the basics of faith and how do people flourish, and are there ways that we can be doing better. And so in the brief time I have, I'll talk about three different areas. The first is my own faith foundation, how it impacts my view of economic policy. The second is our current economic reality, which Steve began to touch on and which I'll talk about a bit more. And the third is a set of policies that I'm thinking about as a person of faith, as an economist, given our current realities for moving forward. And so to begin, I'm an Anglican, and there are wonderful things about being an Anglican, but one of the most wonderful things is that no one knows what it is. So it's a total embrace of Christian mystery, and the closest thing to a good definition is that it's the intersection of being Catholic and evangelical and charismatic all wrapped up as a born-again Christian. So there's that, and I grew up Baptist, so that should make you feel more comfortable. But for undergrad, I went to an evangelical school called Wheaton College. I was in the econ department, so we had a lot of these types of conversations about faith and economics and policy, a lot about God's heart for the poor and the oppressed and our call to be Jesus' hands and feet in the world, a lot about the concept of vocation and calling, and of course the Protestant work ethic was strong there, not just for exams, but in topics we talked about. And this afternoon, I want to discuss something slightly different and slightly new. And to do that, I want to go back to the beginning, to the very beginning, from a Christian perspective, to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, which says that God created man and woman. In the image of God, he created them. And in Christianity, this means that each person has dignity and value and worth at the deepest and the most immortal levels. But there's more, because we're created in the image of God, and the very first thing we read about God is that he creates. And so this concept of Imago Dei has to include our ability to create and to engage in the world, that it's divinely inspired, it's intentional. There's something about our ability to flourish and be people that involves our ability to create and to engage. And this has a lot to say as a principle about economic policy and tracks with some of the more recent thinking about human flourishing. The Nobel Prize winner in economics, Edmund Phelps, back in 2006, recently released a book called Mass Flourishing, where he looks at this question: what does it mean for a person to have a good life? What does it mean for society to flourish? He defines flourishing as an experience with the new. To me, this harkens back to the Imago Dei, to create. And that mass flourishing, when a society is flourishing, broadly, that's because as many people are included in the process of innovation and engagement as possible. And this seems maybe quite basic to us. We talk about in economics as economic opportunity. What's your ability to participate in the system? But as a public policy guidepost, this is relatively new. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th century that we began seeing economies, governments set up on the belief that each individual has value, and we're better off when as many people are as engaged as possible. It's not until the 18th and 19th century where we see capitalism and democracy and some of the great economic freedom thinkers like Adam Smith talking about these ideas not as a means to themselves or means to their own end, but as a means to open up widespread engagement. And of course, nowhere epitomizes this more, despite her flaws, than America, the land of opportunity, the American dream, where people would come and create and engage in a way separate from where they were born or how they looked, that was different and unique and more powerful than before. But no country is perfect, and no system of government is perfect, and that brings us to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is our economic reality. And so, we hear a lot about how well the economy is doing. We've come out of the Great Recession. We're the first economy in the world to surpass $21 trillion. We have low unemployment. Just last week, the U.S. regained its place as the most competitive country in the whole wide world from the World Economic Forum. By a lot of measures, things are going really well. And yet certain people and communities are finding themselves left behind. And it has become increasingly obvious that there's been some drift from America, the land of opportunity, the American dream, than how we've thought about it maybe in the past. And sure enough, Dr. Phelps stops the clock around 1960. The literature on economic opportunity shows some sort of inflection point around 1980, but things have changed. And when you look at our economic reality today, we have a historic share of Americans who are no longer working. Among middle-aged men, the work rates are what they were back in the Great Depression, in those first few years coming out of it. We have one of the lowest work rates in the whole OECD. When you look at families and communities, there's a fraying, there's a breaking apart, which is keeping people in intergenerational poverty, the absolute antithesis of the promise of the land of opportunity. 70% of kids born poor never get out. And by the way, that's irrespective of what the top tax rates are, the regulatory environment, or the broader economic environment around us. And lastly, we're seeing this rise in deaths of despair among middle-aged whites. For the first time in modern history, people are dying younger, and it's primarily because of drug overdoses and suicides and depression. Again, a disengagement, a pulling back, a lack of a belief that I have anything to offer, anybody wants me to participate anymore. And so if we go back to what I said in the beginning and hold to this belief that people are created in God's image, they have dignity and value on their own, and we do believe that everyone has something to contribute and we're better off when as many people are contributing as possible, well then something is wrong with where we're currently at. Something is deeply wrong. And that brings us to the third point of, well, what do we do? And the spoiler alert is that neither political party has all the answers. It's the Anglican mushy middle for you. I do think historically it's very clear that economic freedom has laid the groundwork for as many people to be as involved as possible, and the right has consistently advocated for more regulatory and fiscal restraint. It's necessary, I'd argue, based on what we see right now, it's not sufficient. We're the #1 country in the world for economic freedom. We still have these broader structural issues. And the left is focused on the poor and government programs, and there's been a dramatic ability to reduce poverty and boost consumption. And yet, despite spending $1 trillion a year on anti-poverty programs, the needle on economic opportunity, on engagement, has remained relatively unchanged. And so what I'm thinking about as we move forward is how do we have a dynamic and growing economy that lets as many people contribute and engage as possible in a meaningful way? One of the clear ways to do this is first by encouraging work. I mean, work is a main problem from a macroeconomic perspective, but also from a dignity perspective. We subsidize a lot of things as the United States of America. I think there's very few things we could subsidize that's more important than work itself. And yet work is, any type of wage subsidy, which we do have in place, it's called the Earned Income Tax Credit, is much smaller than the types of subsidies we offer for healthcare or state and local tax deductions or mortgages. It's prioritized relatively low. I think that should be changed, that we should consider a dramatic expansion of a wage subsidy, which has been found to induce workforce participation quite effectively. It's that old Economics 101 adage that if you tax something, you get less of it. If you subsidize something, you get more of it. We should be encouraging work. Not because of my Protestant work ethic, by the way, but because that is where people mostly create and engage with the world around them. That is where most people spend most of their day. And I think that same spirit of creation and engagement should continue into, as you touched on, Stephen, to the charitable sector, that individuals and communities and churches and synagogues can give more creatively to the people around them because they're right there, they're local, as opposed to a distant bureaucracy and a broad program. And yet our current system essentially says we only care if half of the population gives charitably. Only half of the population gets a tax write-off if you give. The other half, your contributions just might not be as valuable or less encouraged, and that has to lead to the belief that there's just less agency to make other people's life better. I think we should reconsider that there should be an incentive across the board for everybody to be able to give and help someone close to them and someone in need. And lastly, when we talk about Imago Dei and everyone being created in God's image, it's one thing to set the broad framework with economic freedom and to encourage work as much as possible and to encourage, us taking care of each other, which should just happen out of our own, well-being, but fine, let's encourage it more with public policy. But the last is we have to acknowledge the structural barriers that are in place for broad creation and flourishing. That we have 20 million men with criminal convictions who have a lot of trouble getting jobs. That we have 1.6 million Americans who've been unemployed for over 6 months and whose job skills have atrophied. They're not a great hire. They need help. What do we do about the 9 million people on permanent disability insurance who, because of the structure of that program, are essentially prohibited from working, even if they could? What about the millions of moms, in particular, who are forced to make a false dichotomy between work and having a family because our labor laws haven't been updated since family structures have dramatically changed? What about the 11 million unauthorized immigrants who operate in a shadow economy. That if we go there into the space of saying we're better off when as many people as possible are included, not only out of a theological belief, but history bears that out, then we need to start addressing these in a more creative way. And so to conclude, how does my faith impact my views on economic policy? Quite a bit. It doesn't say that there's any particular person or political party or style of government that's perfect. In fact, it says quite the opposite, that they're all fallen, which is remarkably freeing and wonderful. But it does suggest a set of values. And the one I talked about today and that I've been thinking about more is the concept of Imago Dei, about our worth and dignity as individuals, what that means from our political rancor and discourse all the way down to what it means for economics, and how do we let people contribute and create and participate more than the current status quo. And so I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.